Many times in life, suffering comes slowly. You can see it coming. There's time to get ready, to prepare for what you know that you will face. But at other times, suffering can come out of nowhere. In a moment, our lives can be changed forever. I'm always reminded at this time of year, I know that if I log into Facebook, the website, in about 2 weeks' time, I'll be reminded of a time when suffering felt like a ton of bricks falling from the sky. Of when a friend of mine lost her best friend, a 34-year-old wife and mother, to a head-on collision on the road caused by a drunk driver. And I remember the rawness of those first posts 8 years ago as my friend put the news on her profile page, as she linked to articles in the local press, as she shared happy photos of this woman and her family that had been taken just a few weeks earlier. And then as she asked for memories for the memorial service, and as she railed against those who drive over the limit. Over the years that have passed, the tributes have become more muted. But I know that every year, in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be reminded that disaster can strike out of nowhere and that it can be crushing when it comes. And I found reading Ruth chapter 1 over this last week a little bit like looking at those posts, because to read this chapter is to look in on someone's great suffering. It's to watch a life be torn apart by disasters that seem to strike from nowhere. Not the life of Ruth, after whom the book is named, but the life of Naomi in the first instance. This woman whose tragic loss of her husband and then her 2 sons is the trigger to the story and gives it shape. But before we delve in, let's check out where we are in the Bible. We're in the 8th book of the Bible this morning, and the events recorded in this book, we learn in verse 1, occurred in the days when the judges ruled. And if you were here earlier in the year, you'd have been here when we were reading the 7th book of the Bible, the book of Judges. And we saw in this book that it was a bleak time in the history of Israel. Israel had needed God to save them from the invading enemy nations again and again, through men such as Gideon and Samson, because again and again God's people Israel had forgotten God and followed the gods of the nations that they were supposed to have driven out. As the final verse of the book says, it was a time when everyone did as they saw fit, whatever seemed right to them. But wonderfully, the book of Ruth, set in the same era, shows us that there were Israelites, even in this season, who loved God and who did what pleased him. But most of that is to come in chapters 2, 3, and 4. And in chapter 1, we begin in the depths. But I hope, as we look at Naomi's suffering this morning, we'll begin to see how even here the Lord was at work and how Jesus is God's answer ultimately, both to her suffering and to ours. Because, of course, many of us will not only have looked in on the suffering of others, but will have experienced it ourselves. We'll be experiencing it at the moment, whether suffering that's come slowly or suffering that's dropped like a ton of bricks out of nowhere. And either way, we've been left struggling to cope. Well, the book of Ruth will give us great hope. And even today, as we start in the depths, I think we'll begin to see that hope. And we'll look at Naomi's story in chapter 1 through 3 points and 3 letter Ds. And the first is disaster, from verses 1 to 5. Naomi's story begins with disaster. Famine falls upon the land of Israel. It's a little bit hard to imagine living in the UK today, still a reality in other parts of the world. But famine is just a shortage of food. And famines were common occurrences in the ancient Near Middle East where this occurred. God had warned his people through Moses that he would send famines to punish them if they disobeyed him, to test whether they would rely on him, to draw them back to him. And at other times, famines weren't related to sin. They were simply just part of life in a society which was a bit more hand-to-mouth, reliant on agriculture and farming, perhaps more so than the UK is today. And our narrator doesn't tell us why this particular famine came. Was it the result of Israel's sin, or was it just circumstance? We don't know. But we do know that this man named Elimelech from Bethlehem in Judah moved away, struggling to find food in Bethlehem, whose name ironically means house of bread. They moved to the neighbouring Moab. Here it is on the map. Here's Judah, the end of the arrow is pointing at Bethlehem, and then Moab just over here. And Moab and Israel didn't have a great track record as neighbours. The Moabites were the descendants of Lot, the relative of Abraham. So they weren't Canaanites. They hadn't been living in the Promised Land. They lived next to the Promised Land. But when the Israelites had passed through Moab on their way from Egypt to the Promised Land, in Numbers chapter 22, Balak, the king of Moab, had told Balaam to come and curse them, because he was so scared of them. And then once they made it into the Promised Land, you might remember that the Moabites featured in Judges chapter 3. Big-bellied Eglon was the king of Moab. And in Judges 3, he brought the Moabites in, and they oppressed Israel for 18 years. So it wasn't the smoothest of neighbouring relationships. Should Elimelech and his family have left Israel for Moab, where the grass was quite literally greener? Probably not. I suspect they should have held out in Bethlehem like most others did, trusting that God wouldn't let his people starve, that he would end the famine. But the narrator doesn't comment. The narrator doesn't tell us that this was a sin, so I don't think we should judge them too harshly. And you get the feeling as it begins that it was intended just to be a brief sojourn, but it soon became permanent, and they ended up living there for many years. But while they're there, disaster struck. Elimelech died. Was this God's punishment on a man who led his family away from God's land, presence, and provision? Maybe, but again, the text doesn't say, so we don't know for sure. Later on, Naomi's sons married Moabite women. Was this the right thing to do? God's people had been forbidden from marrying Canaanites, although again the Moabites weren't Canaanites, although Deuteronomy 23 says that the Moabites and their offspring weren't allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord until the 10th generation. So perhaps it wasn't a great idea, but again, as with the father, so with the sons. The narrator just records their actions and then their deaths without any comment. And then, tragedy upon tragedy, disaster strikes again. In verse 5, Naomi's sons both die, and what's worse, they die childless. In any society, for a woman to bury her husband and both her children would be a tragedy. But in the ancient Near East, it was a disaster. Naomi was pretty much too old to marry and have children again. Education, work wouldn't have been an option for her. There was no welfare state or charity sector to fall back on. Naomi was left in a very difficult situation, with no one to provide for her and no way to provide for herself. She was destitute. Naomi, whose future had seemed like it would be sorted through this brief trip to greener-grassed Moab, was now destitute. Disaster upon disaster had struck her out of nowhere. And we still perhaps have questions. Had it struck her out of nowhere? Had she known that they were not making good calls in moving to Moab? Was this God's punishment on her? Had she played a part in that decision to leave for Moab, for her sons to marry outside of Israel? Or had these decisions all been made for her by the men in her life? We don't know. But what we do know is that this is Naomi's story now. It's Naomi who's left to pick up the pieces. The men are all dead, and their shadows hang heavily over this woman who's left to make a life for herself, simply to try to survive on her own. The story begins with disaster. Our second D is decision. Verses 6 through to verse 18. News from home reaches Naomi in verse 6. The famine is over. God had visited his people. He's passed through their land. He's brought blessing, rain, sunshine, crops, food. And as if awaking from a decade-long stupor, Naomi sees clearly. And her decision feels immediate. She's going home. If suffering is the background of this chapter, then this decision to go home in response to the message of God's provision is at the heart of it. And there's just one Hebrew word that gets repeated 11 times in the chapter. We don't notice in our English translations because it's translated with different words and phrases. Go back, turn back, return home. It's one Hebrew word. Naomi will not stay a moment longer in this land of Moab than she has to. This land is no home for her now. The rest of this chapter is about her journey home and back along the road to Israel. At least in Bethlehem, her old neighbours might take pity on her and show her charity, as she couldn't expect such treatment as a foreign woman living in Moab. And so Naomi prepares and sets out immediately. But this isn't the only decision in this chapter. There's another decision to be made. And actually, this second decision dominates this journey home narrative that takes from verse 7 right through to verse 19. Because Naomi isn't on her own. She has her two Moabite daughters-in-law, her dead son's wives, still with her, Orpah and Ruth. What is to be done with them? Like all good mothers-in-law, Naomi makes the decision for them. She releases them. The bonds of family were far tighter in the ancient Near East than they are in many cultures today, certainly in the West today. Orpah and Ruth would have felt and would have been seen as having a huge debt towards Naomi, having a great responsibility to care for her in her widowhood. And so initially there would have been no question about what they would do. Of course they would go back with her to Bethlehem, although it of course wasn't their home. They'd never set foot in Israel. They were from Moab. But Naomi, in an act of great generosity and self-sacrifice, releases them. She lets them go. They don't have to stay with her. It's okay. They can go home. And it's tough love, isn't it? It's kindness mixed with self-sacrifice on her own part and just pragmatism. She commends them for their kindness to her and her family. She prays for the Lord's blessing on them, and she urges them to have a second chance, to go home, to marry again, and to try again to have children. They don't need to feel bound to her. They don't need to accept her fate of destitution and despair as single women, as widows. And they mustn't think that things with Naomi may turn a corner. For Naomi feels that she has been cursed by God. The Lord's hand has turned against me, she says in verse 13. No good will come to her from God now. No good will come to them if they stay with her. They should go home, she says, to Moab. After many tears in verse 14, Orpah makes her decision. Now, she has shown great kindness and faithfulness to Naomi in having made it this far. But at this point, Orpah accepts Naomi's verdict on events, Naomi's prophecy of the future, and Naomi's offer of release. And she kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and goes home to Moab. But Ruth won't go. Ruth, too, has made her decision, and she still stood there. In fact, not stood, but clinging to Naomi in verse 14, refusing to let this woman go. You can almost hear a hint of impatience in Naomi's voice in verse 15. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. We don't need your heroics today, Ruth. Just go." But Ruth won't go. And now it's her turn to speak. And in words that echo God's covenantal promise to his people, recorded in Genesis 17, given to Abraham and to Moses in Exodus 6, "I will be your God, you will be my people." Ruth commits herself to Naomi's side, to Naomi's people, and to Naomi's God. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Not even death will separate these two women. Ruth will not go home. Stunned by this speech, Naomi has no option but to accept Ruth's decision, and the two women walk together on the road to Bethlehem. So we've seen disaster, we've seen decision, and finally, we see despair. Now, we can be forgiven for thinking that as Naomi arrives back in Bethlehem with Ruth by her side, the story might start to pick up. But we don't get a glorious homecoming and joyful reunion back here in Bethlehem. Not because of the people of Bethlehem don't welcome Naomi and Ruth. They're surprised, but I think glad to see Naomi home. But because of the deep despair and anger that Naomi feels and expresses. I'm sure we all know that feeling. It's as if she sees the old familiar gates of her hometown, the architecture she knows so well, the people she's known for so many years, and suddenly it all hits her. All the busyness of grieving, of planning this decision home to go home, of making the journey, it's all over. She gets home and it hits her. All that she's lost stares her in the face. This future she faces as a destitute widow hits her like a ton of bricks. And Naomi straight away has to make them all know that she is not the same old pleasant one Naomi, as her Hebrew name Naomi means, that she was when she left. But her life tells a different story now. They can call her Mara, which means bitter. For the Lord sent her away physically hungry, but in every other sense full, or at least full of potential, with a husband, 2 sons, hope and a future. But he has brought her back physically satisfied, for now at least, but in every other sense empty. 3 dead men, no grandchildren, no hope, no future. "The Lord has afflicted me," she tells her old friends. "The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Naomi may be back home in Bethlehem. She may have Ruth by her side. The barley harvest may be beginning. But as the dust settles, all that has happened to Naomi in Moab, all that she's lost, fills her with despair and with anger. And if you're anything like me, you're longing to know, what does God think? What does God make of her complaint? He hasn't said anything in this book so far. But again, we're not told. Does God think this is the ravings of a bitter old woman? Or does he think that there's something in it? Does he know that he has dealt her a raw hand? We're not told. God stays silent. We're left to work it out for ourselves as the book continues. But one thing we perhaps do notice as Naomi slides into despair is that Ruth seems to have disappeared. She's last mentioned in verse 18, and then last referred to at all in verse 19. It seems that Ruth has been forgotten, till verse 22 at least. There's no introduction of Ruth by Naomi to the women of Bethlehem. There's no mention of Ruth still by her side from Naomi as she brings her complaint about and to God. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Can you see where Naomi's eyes are fixed? They're fixed on herself. She's lost, as we all so often do in suffering. She's lost that perspective. She sees only her own desperate situation and her desperate feelings. She sees, but not clearly. For Naomi sees only the God who is sovereign. And there's much that's right in what she says in these couple of verses, verse 20 and 21. In fact, it is pretty much all right, I think. I think Naomi is right to attribute to God her husband's death, her daughter-in-law's infertility, and the demise of her 2 sons. Now, some who'd call themselves believers would rail against this. How could a good, kind God do such a thing? But if we believe the Bible, then we believe in a God who's sovereign. On a big scale, he sends the famine and he sends the food. And on a little, personal scale, he gives husbands and sons and he takes them away. We believe, if we believe the Bible, in a God who's in charge over both good and evil. Not responsible for evil, not doing evil, but sovereign, in charge over it. And that might sound strange, and it may at first feel, when disaster strikes, comforting to believe that such things could never come from God, could never be part of his will, that he could never be allowing hardship to come our way. But it's a cold comfort, that thought. It's a short-lived reassurance. For do we really want a God who's trying but can't stop evil, who's powerless to stop evil, who's too weak to stop bad things happening to us? Do we really want a God who may or may not ultimately win the battle against evil? No, at least I don't. There's faith in Naomi here. What she says is true, though her faith is flawed. She sees that God is in charge, that as he once brought good into her life, so he's now brought hardship. And I wonder, do we see that as we face suffering? Will we accept hardship from God's hands, or only good? Will we trust that God is sovereign, that he's in charge, that he's got us, no matter what he's allowed to come our way? But that's not the whole picture for Naomi or for us. She's seen that God is sovereign, but there's something that she's missed. And it speaks not so much in the content of her words, I think, as in the attitude. And she's missed that God is kind. Naomi hasn't seen God's kindness to her. For God has not left Naomi stuck in Moab on her own, a destitute foreign widow. He's brought her home. And he's not brought her home to a land still ravaged by famine. He's brought her home to a land of plenty, a land where, the final verse tells us, the barley harvest was beginning. And most importantly of all, God has not brought Naomi home alone. He's brought her home with Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law. Verse 22. Though it may feel like all loss and no gain to Naomi, though she may not be able to see that she has anything in light of all that's gone, her story is not over. God's hand has not turned against Naomi for good. He is still blessing her and preparing to bless her. And though God holds his tongue in response to Naomi's tirade here, haven't we already seen a sign of just how God will be kind to this poor, broken woman again? the ancient Near East setting of these events. It's such an unfamiliar world to us. And we're so familiar with our Bibles, with the books of the Bible, that it's easy to miss the fact that Ruth was a Moabite. Ruth was not always one of God's people. She was not ethnically, geographically from Israel. She had not been born into God's people. She had not been part of God's people for decades until she married in. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, the Exodus, the Ten Commandments, the tabernacle. These were not Ruth's traditions, not Ruth's cultures, not Ruth's beliefs. And to have a book of the Hebrew Old Testament named after a Moabite woman, that'd be like finding a book called Fatima in the New Testament. It would have been shocking, so jarring would the cultural difference have been. Ruth feels now just part of the furniture of the Christian faith. But this was not always so. Moabite Ruth's decision to cleave to a people who were not her own, to be joined at the hip to Naomi, Ruth's unnecessary, unasked for, uncelebrated commitment to give the rest of her life to this people who, besides Naomi, she didn't know, whose God she hadn't grown up worshipping, whose land she'd never visited. Well, this commitment is incredible. No wonder it left Naomi speechless. And do you see where it's pointing? Do you see the solution to our suffering that it points to? Because Jesus was not always one of us. He was the King of heaven, the one who's existed since before creation began, the eternal Son of God who had forever enjoyed life with his Father far beyond our earth. Jesus was not always one of us. Yet he did what Ruth did. He became one of us. He cleaved to a people who were not his own, who had rejected his Father, and he committed his life to us. Unasked for by the people of his day, mostly uncelebrated and unknown for at least the first 30 years of his life, Jesus came down and was made one of us. And just as Ruth, he lived where we live. He went where we went. He stayed where we stayed. And then he died as one of us in our place. This is God's kindness to us. And through God's kindness to us, we will never be separated from God again. And another little hint of the gospel is that Jesus was afflicted. What Naomi felt to have been the case for her, what she spoke so strongly of, how she felt God to have treated her, Jesus really did experience. There's no doubt about it. Jesus was afflicted. The Father's hand turned against him. The Father turned his face away from his only Son on the cross. Jesus was abandoned, forsaken, and left empty on the cross. Naomi's life was hard. But it was not ebbing away in the way that she felt it was. And Ruth sacrificed herself for Naomi, but she didn't die to save Naomi. But Jesus did. He chose to be afflicted that we might never truly have God's hand turn against us. What Naomi in part experienced and declared of herself, Jesus experienced in full because he loves us. That's God's kindness to us. God holds his tongue at the end of this chapter as Naomi rails against him, but the seeds are sown for God to fill this empty woman again. If only she could see his hand behind this. And the rest of the book will give God's gentle and gracious response to Naomi's bitter complaint. And we'll see how God filled this woman's life up again to an even higher place, bringing her into the line of Jesus through the kind, generous actions, first of Ruth and then of Boaz. But for now, we need to pause there. But I hope this morning that we see something of God's kindness to us. We see the reality of suffering, that it will be part of our lives here as God's people, but that God is not absent from us in it. It's not somehow swerved out of his control and beyond his power. That God hasn't turned his hand against us when times are hard. That he's with us by his Spirit as we suffer. And that he will use our suffering to draw us to him and to bless us even more. That no matter how badly he lets us suffer, he will never truly turn his hand against us, because he turned his hand against his Son instead.